Oh, goodness. Yeah. So quick question for everybody. Curious about video games. Do you have, and now Riz, you're a video game player, big time, obviously. I mean, by profession, right?
By profession more than actually, but I don't actually play that many games anymore, but I used to play more.
Okay. Well, this question is for the span of your life, okay? And I'm curious about if you've played a compelling, if there's ever been a video game that you've got lost in, like it was so compelling that you just kind of got sucked into it, sort of full stop. I have one.
I have one, but it's going to be really, really embarrassing because I typically, like you, Riz, don't play video games.
Okay.
But when I was completing my PhD, this is back in the 1980s,
okay.
on a little sort of Mac SE Plus.
Ooh, right.
My go-to, I had two go-to games. I had Tetris and I had Crystal Quest, which probably doesn't exist anymore.
Internet Archive. 100%.
I got incredibly good at both of them.
Nice. That was where you went to not work on your PhD.
The hours of not working on my PhD, yes.
Yep. Yeah. For me, so I have a couple because I still play. I not nearly as with kids and stuff, not nearly as much as I used to or would even like to, perhaps. But the original game that got me was TSR's 1988. It's like the official Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Pool of Radiance. That game, it was all 5 1/4 inch floppy, right? That game, it's hard to even explain because, of course, the game, if you play it, you can play it on Internet Archive and you can look it up. Wonderful game, but it's just, it's the simplest 8-bit graphic, 256 colors, very simple. But it's the storytelling of it is so compelling. I would get just completely lost into this thing where my entire, those memes where I think it's from A Beautiful Mind where you see like the equations floating through space. For me, that was always armor class, hit points, all this stuff for all these D&D characters. And just got and to the point where that game I used to, so I had it like in a little emulator too. So I used to play it on, do you remember the little 11-inch MacBook Airs?
Oh, yes.
So I still had mine. To this date, I think it was one of my most favorite devices I've ever owned. But that was the best airplane computer ever. And these transatlantic flights between Amsterdam and Detroit, I would sit there, I would turn this emulator, and I would play Pool of Radiance on the flight. So the airplane is dark, everyone's sleeping, whatever.
There you are, playing away.
Playing around. And then, of course, I have to look up. This is one of those games that it used to come with like a translation wheel that would translate things from like these, I think they were like Elvish runes to like characters. Because that was like their copyright check was like, to start the game, translate this, whatever. And you had this wheel, but of course the wheel disintegrated and I would just have this like 80-page PDF. So I'm sitting on this airplane, scrolling through 80-page PDF, finding the characters, put in. But yeah, that was a game that to this day I still think is even though the graphics are incredibly limited, it just captures you.
But actually, this is interesting. I love your take on this, Riz. So my sense is it's actually the storytelling rather than the graphics. I have never been enamored with incredibly fine graphics. I've been enamored with the storytelling that comes with it.
Yeah, I think that's one of the keys, for a game to be interesting enough that you want to keep playing the game. That the graphics may draw you in, but they're not really what keeps you playing on an ongoing basis. It's really the game mechanics. And that's how we define, in the video game industry, we like say, find the fun.
Yes.
Right. So you have to figure out which aspect. And usually when you have a new game idea, sometimes people will do a very slice of functionality prototype. But you have to show the fun part of the game.
Right.
Yeah.
But going back to when I was a kid, I used to play the Atari games. Way back when. And Space Invaders. And
okay.
Adventure.
Yeah, so, I should have gone back
I used to lose
further.
myself in those. But if I were to come more recent, I would say the game that I probably spent the most time in wasn't really a game. It was Second Life.
Oh, sure.
Which was a virtual world. So it was
Yeah.
when I was getting my master's at Stanford, I had switched from a PC to a Mac. And when I did that, I lost a lot of ability to play a lot of PC games.
We all did.
Back then. I mean, now I suppose you can again, but I never got back in the habit of
still
playing.
Not great.
Yeah, it's still not great. But they had a port for the Second Life client. And so I spent a ton of time just exploring this virtual world. And I was just fascinated by what made other people spend so much time.
So did you get involved with world building there and even making money and spending money?
Well, I spent a lot of money just buying, furniture for my home.
For your digital house.
Yeah, but I met a lot of content creators, and they would design like hair and dresses, a lot of like female clothes, and that's where they made most of their money.
Yeah,
and so I would spend a lot of time just asking them about, why do you do this? And, I mean, there are people who had a job as a bartender in a virtual bar in Second Life, and they had to be there at like 9 p.m. Yeah, the shift, exactly. And
my gosh.
the owner of the bar was paying them
in
Linden dollars, which were worth pennies at the time. But so they had a real job. They would go home from the real job, and then at night they would log in, and that was their idea of fun.
Oh my gosh.
And people would actually get married and have like committed relationships, even though they were married in real life. They would have they say, "Oh, I got to ask my husband. Was he your real life husband?" No, my
my second
life husband. Yeah.
Well, I feel like that would be worth a follow-up. How many of those people are still married to right?
I did meet a few people who actually then met the person in real life.
Oh, right.
And then at least a couple of them got married. And
so interesting. That's wild.
There was a recent documentary called We Met in VR. It wasn't about Second Life. It was about VR chat.
Sure.
But it was the same kind of thing where people got from different parts of the world, got to know each other and went on virtual dates and spent all this time together in the virtual world, had virtual sex, all this stuff, and virtual dancing, and then they met in real life. Now, it didn't always work out.
Sure.
In fact, I would say a lot of times when they met in person, it didn't work out. Well, I don't think it was that bad back then around the catfishing, but or they would just not be compatible, but they thought they were because they spent all their time in these.
You don't look like your profile picture,
your avatar.
Where are the ears?
Never do. Never do.
You don't look like a furry, which is what your avatar
That's
was.
what I signed up for in this relationship.
Oh my, yeah. Well, I can't. I have no experience with that. But like, I was just gonna say, one of the things, the games, a more recent game is that some of the newer Zelda games in the franchise, like Breath of the Wild, and the immersive environment is it is just gorgeous. But also, too, it was a game where, like, one of the aspects of the game is you can always make food. So you have to gather stuff. You could spend out, like, intentionally with bliss, spend hours just walking through a digital forest, collecting apples and acorn and whatever. But it was just an incredibly immersive experience, even though it was not a VR type of experience at all. Red Dead Redemption 2, that's another one where you can just get lost.
News coming out here. I knew nothing of this, Sean.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. But okay, so the reason I asked that question is today on Modem Futura, we're joined by a very special guest, Rizwan Virk, to talk about the simulation hypothesis. And this is, of course, I think is going to be incredibly fun because it is a philosophical, scientific question that crosses boundaries between computer science, physics, and metaphysics. So I'm extremely excited.
Did we have religion in there as well?
We just now added it. So there it is.
Religion is in there.
Spirituality and religion, exactly.
Yeah. In fact, the class that I teach some years here at ASU is called Science Fiction, Technology, Religion, and Philosophy.
Oh, very good.
Because it's about as interdisciplinary a subject as you can get. And we go deep, relatively deep, as much as you can in a class that has all these different topics.
Yeah, absolutely.
In each of these areas.
Absolutely. So let's just jump right in.
Sounds good.
Initializing waveform.
Modulating signals for transmission.
Exploring the possible, probable, and preferable futures.
Welcome to Modem Futura. I'm Sean Leahy.
I'm Andrew Maynard.
And that means this must be Modem Futura. And today we are joined by our special guest. In fact, Riz, you are our first in-person guest for Modem Futura. So I bestow that award
So
slash.
this fails miserably. Thanks, Riz.
No pressure.
I've unlocked a quest here, an achievement.
No
More like an
pressure.
achievement, yeah.
No pressure, but it kind of our success with whether we invite anyone back is going to hinge on how this goes. But let me read your introduction really quick, so people who may not be familiar with you. Rizwan Virk is a computer scientist, venture capitalist, and video game pioneer. He was the founder of Play Labs at MIT, currently at ASU's College of Global Futures, and a venture partner at Griffin Gaming Partners. He is the best-selling author of The Simulation Hypothesis, which I have a copy sitting right here on our desk, The Simulated Multiverse, Wisdom of a Yogi, and Zen Entrepreneurship. You can follow him at Riz Stanford and at his website, zenentrepreneur.com. And we'll put all those socials in the show notes so you can follow. So, Riz, welcome. Welcome to Modem Futura.
Thanks for having me, and I'm honored to be your first in-person guest.
We're honored to have you.
Okay, simulation hypothesis. Where would you like to start? Give us the quick version of what this even is.
Well, I think the simplest explanation for the simulation hypothesis is that it's the idea that the physical world, as we know it, is not physical at all, but really is part of a virtual world, a computer simulation or a massively multiplayer online role-playing game, depending on how you look at it. Now, the one question that people always ask me is, well, how did you get around to writing this book? And
what pulled you in? Why on earth did you fall down this rabbit hole in the first place?
And it's a pretty deep rabbit hole, as I've discovered. And what happened was I sold my last video game company in like 2016, and I was visiting a startup that we worked with in San Francisco, actually in Marin County, which is right across from San Francisco Bay, and they were building a virtual reality suite of games, and one of those was a VR ping pong game. And so I decided to try it on because it was kind of the hot new thing in Silicon Valley. It was one of what I call these hype cycles that Silicon Valley goes through. And in 2016, VR was in one of its hype cycles. And so I put on this VR headset, and it was a pretty big, bulky headset. I mean, you couldn't.
Yeah. 2016, that's like MetaQuest was, so that was like kind of right post-acquisition from
Oculus.
Right?
Yeah, it was still called Oculus.
Yeah.
And this was the HTC Vive, which was the other big, slightly better graphics at the time. Headset, and we had wires coming down from the ceiling.
All the motion sensors and things that you'd have to put in the room.
Were set up in the room.
Right. Yep.
And so I started to play this game, and what happened was, for a moment, the physics engine was so good. And this is where I think the point that we were talking about earlier is important. The graphics weren't great.
Right.
I mean, it wasn't even a realistic looking opponent, but the table looked realistic, and most importantly, the responsiveness was so good. Like it actually felt like if I put my hand here, the paddle really was hitting the ball, and the physics of the ball would go to the other side and come back. So much so that for a moment I forgot I was in VR.
Right.
Yeah.
And I tried to put the paddle down on the table, and I tried to
had that moment.
I tried to lean against the table too, and of course there was no table.
Right.
The controller fell to the floor, and I almost fell over. And so that kind of got me thinking, well, how long would it take? Now, it only lasted a moment.
Sure.
Because it was obvious that with the wires and everything and this, what we used to call the toaster on your face, because they were big and bulky back then. They still are kind of big and bulky. But
just a slightly smaller toaster.
But hopefully they're getting to the sunglasses stage soon. But so I started to wonder how long it would take us meaning, Silicon Valley or just human technology, civilization in general, to get to the point where we could build something that was so immersive that you would really forget
it.
that you were in VR. And it would basically be something like The Matrix. So how long would it take us to build something like The Matrix? And so I came up with this idea of the simulation point, which I call a kind of technological singularity. Right? Most people think of the singularity as being either the point where superintelligence kicks in, exponential growth, or thanks to Ray Kurzweil, where humans merge.
It's always near.
With machines, yes.
With machines.
Yes.
And if you look at Werner Vinge, who passed away sadly recently, who wrote the paper on the singularity, he had 3 or 4 different ways we could reach what he called the technological singularity. And so I like to think this is another type of technological singularity, and I define it as the point at which we can create virtual worlds which are indistinguishable from physical reality, filled with AI characters that are indistinguishable from biological beings. Yeah, we're not there yet, but that's what got me down the rabbit hole.
Right, and I know you've got this sort of scale, haven't you? Because occasionally I see you talking about, well, we've reached level X, Y, and Z.
Right, yeah. So there were 10 stages in that. And, stage 1, 2, and 3 were related to video games that we've been talking about, going all the way back to text adventure games, graphic arcade, graphic adventure games, and then VR and AR are kind of the stage that we're at now.
Sure.
We still don't have photorealistic AR, although with Apple's Vision Pro.
Apple's Vision Pro is pretty good, actually, with the mixed environment. Yeah.
Right. And so it's pretty good. In fact, somebody put a video up of a Vision Pro, I guess you call it prototype because it wasn't real, but it looked like it was real, where you could go into your kitchen and you could say, okay, now I want a 1950s version.
Right.
And it would basically transform your kitchen into a 1950s version. And that's speaking of science fiction and Werner Vinge, that was evocative of the novel Rainbow's End, if you guys have ever read that, which Zuckerberg cites as one of his inspirations around AR, where you could be in a library that was bare bones and you can make it look like a medieval dungeon. And the books would look like these old, handwritten things.
But also, isn't this interesting? Because you've got this sort of futuristic fantasy of being able to completely redefine the environment you're in, which is where we seem to be going with virtual reality. But you can see it's a very small step from there being able to recreate it to getting so immersed in it that you can't tell the difference between reality and not reality.
Right. And that's one of the interesting things about Apple's Vision Pro is they started to not use virtual reality or augmented reality as terms, but they started to use spatial computing.
Right.
And, it's almost like a dial. You dial in the world around you. Or you dial it out, in which case you're fully immersed
and
in
it's
the world.
compelling. I mean, I'm probably one of the only people that love my Apple Vision Pro. But
I haven't used it since I bought it, to be totally honest with you.
You and probably a lot of other people.
It's sitting there, and I'm like, I intend to use it again, but I never get around to it.
I find it compelling. And I actually work in there. I can't do any entertainment stuff because it just gets uncomfortable, but working.
Right.
But even things like I've got my calendar up there, and it feels like a physical thing hovering in front of me because I've got the real room, and I feel as if I could pick it up and move it around.
Well, I used it for entertainment a little bit because we don't have a TV anymore that we use. We just use an iPad.
Yeah, you've got a screen already.
But then I figured, okay, this would be a way to have,
the biggest.
My partner won't let me fill our wall with the giant
But you
screen
can put the headset on.
movies.
So I feel when I do that, I feel the weight of it really quickly.
Yeah, that's what I found. I tried to watch the Fellowship of the Ring.
Oh my God!
Don't start with something like that.
Yeah, and they had a room that looked like a medieval
the full cinema
theater, or cinema.
Yeah.
So that part was great, but after a while, it just became a little uncomfortable.
and that's a doozy of a film. That's 3.5 plus hours to wear with a toaster on your face. So I want to just put a pin in something, Riz, that you had mentioned, because I think we'll probably get to it in many different ways. But the idea of that singularity point too, right? Because I think there is this sort of philosophical question to which we could ask now: is do we live in a simulation already? How would we know? And I think a lot of people would, I shouldn't say a lot of people agree, but it's a common sentiment that if we are able to create the technology that you just mentioned, to reach that sort of singularity point, that would be the definitive conclusion that we already are living in a simulation, because we've now been able to, it's like this recursive
proof of principle.
Proof of principle, right? Like if we can build it, then we can just assume we already are in one.
Right, or that the chances that we are in one goes up. And so this is the logic that Elon Musk used actually all the way back in 2016, the same year that I was playing ping pong. And we'll talk about ping pong a little bit more because it keeps coming up. But basically, he said that if there were billions of simulated worlds and there's only one physical world, then which one are you most likely to be in if the graphics have gotten so good that you can't tell the difference?
How would you know?
Right, and you can't. And that really was relying on an argument by Nick Bostrom, who wrote a paper all the way back in 2003 titled, "Are you living in a computer simulation, or are we living in a computer simulation?" depending on which version of the paper you look at. But which is interesting in and of itself, that there's two versions of the classic.
There's a Nick Bostrom glitch there.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, it's interesting. I was listening to something, I think it was earlier this week, it was one of the great courses on this, exploring metaphysics from David Kyle Johnson. And he was talking about, I think it might be the same sort of analogy. It was like if you're in a dark room, no light, and there's 100 hats, right? And only one hat is blue, and all the rest are red. And it's like and then you choose one at random. And that one hat being red symbolizes the base reality, everyone else being a simulation, to that point of like, well, statistically, chances are if there's one, if there's only one base reality, the chances are that you're in the simulation is so much greater than being in the base one, which is sort of
if it's possible to reach that level.
If it's possible at all.
And that's the key point, because if you look at Bostrom's original argument, well, first of all, what we just talked about is the simplified. I call it the simplified simulation argument. His actual paper was on the number of simulated beings inside simulated worlds, which would be in the trillions potentially.
Yes.
But his basic argument was that there were three possibilities. One, that no civilization ever reaches this point.
Yep.
Why? Because maybe it's not possible, or maybe civilizations always blow themselves up before they get to that point. The second is that it's possible for civilization to get there. It gets there, but for some reason it outlaws these fully realistic simulations. Now, he called it post-human. He was mostly concerned with AI.
Right. Yep.
And then the third possibility, he said, is we are most likely living in a simulation. And if you boil those three down to two, or even if you keep them at three, the argument that we are most likely in a simulation is only one of three or one of two. So at most you get 50%, or Bostrom would say a third, because he says there's three possibilities.
But I've got to ask you something here. So all of this is predicated on the idea that you've got some sort of intelligence or civilization that evolves to the point where they can create the technology necessary to create this simulation. But is anybody talking about the theory that the whole universe, including us, is just data? And what we experience is some sort of instantiation of that data. So maybe this hasn't been designed, but maybe all of physicality is just an illusion. We're just a sort of bunch of sort of ones and zeros or whatever.
Well, and I do get a lot into that in my book.
Right.
And so when people ask me to break down, okay, what do you mean by the simulation hypothesis? Beyond like the higher level definition, I say, well, if you break it down, it breaks down into a couple of key points. The first is that the universe is information.
Right.
And I think that's a point that is not as controversial as it sounds initially. In fact, I met a Nobel Prize winning physicist at the University of Cambridge, where I was this summer researching AI, and we were talking about it, and he goes, well, that first point is not controversial anymore in physics. But he was implying that it used to be.
Yes, so, and I would actually say, I would suspect that most people listening to this will think that's a weird idea. But the people that study this, this is actually quite a common idea, that we just live in this sea of information. And it's how it sort of comes together and actually creates some sort of experience.
Yeah, and John Wheeler, who is one of the last physicists alive to work with Einstein and Bohr, he had a famous phrase that he came up with near the end of his life, which was "it from bit." And what he said was anything that's a physical it, an object like this table or this coffee cup, actually consists at the bottom level when you go to look for this thing called particles. He said the only thing he could really find was the answers to a series of yes/no questions. And that's basically a set of bits.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. It's
Yeah. And so that part is not as controversial as it sounds. The second part is, how do we then assemble that to get the experience of the world? And that's where I like to say that it's like a video game. That basically when you're in a video game, you think your character is actually in a field, but there's no actual field.
Right.
Or there's no actual dragon. It's just bits which your device, quote unquote device, renders for you. And so I think that's the second part of it that I think is key, is that it gets rendered in such a way.
Yes.
And then another point that I like to make is that it's all a hoax or an illusion. and so when people say, do you really believe in the simulation hypothesis? I say, well, I think each of those has its points.
Right.
That if you take them all together, you can kind of come to the conclusion that the world is a kind of illusion. And that's what led me deeply down not just a philosophical rabbit hole, but the religious rabbit hole.
Yes.
Looking at different ancient traditions, and I realized they were just using different metaphors. That if these religions were to be founded today, they would use updated techno-scientific metaphors. And so anyway, those were kind of the
and I
three
actually think
big
you're
areas.
beginning to see sort of proto-religions beginning to sort of emerge like that, aren't you?
Yeah, I call the simulation hypothesis the first meme religion. Right, because you'll see online, and you can go to like Twitter or wherever and search for the simulators, and people will be using it in the same way that people used to say, well, God won't, God make this happen? And they'll say,
Right.
oh, how could the simulators allow this to happen?
Yeah, I know. You can see it's incredibly compelling. So what I find fascinating about this, and I know because I know you, I suspect that you really do believe in the simulation, even though you're extremely good at sort of hedging when you sort of talk about it. I must confess, I'm a deep skeptic, and I've written about sort of my skepticism.
Sure.
And so it really, really irritates me every time I talk to you. I can begin to sort of imagine how this could be a possibility.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would even let me be the neutral. I'll be the neutral party. Okay. But I think, and this will be the most neutral perspective I think possible. But do you both think it would be a fair statement to say that at present we don't have enough information either way to either confirm or rule it out?
Okay, so if I go first, I would say from everything we know about the way the universe works, the laws of the universe, the physics of the universe, it is exceptionally difficult to imagine how we could create the technologies necessary for the simulation. But there's a huge but there. Yeah. 2 huge buts.
None of which are sitting in this room.
Right, yes,
we all look good. I just want to say we all look very fit.
Yes, what am I saying here? Okay, but the first one is the idea that maybe the laws of physics that we are sort of basing all of this on are part of the simulation. Maybe somebody has created a simulation where these are the laws, but it doesn't mean that you have to comply with the laws if you're outside the simulation. So that begins to wipe out that argument. And the second argument is, even though I'm a physicist and I say you've got all these great laws that determine things, there are too many physicists these days who are asking questions about our base assumptions about those laws and those principles.
Yeah.
So even though I don't think that it's possible, there's a little frisson of doubt there, which makes life interesting.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's been interesting for me is like, I'm not ready to call it how I feel because same thing is I'll be like, well, what is the evidence that we are like, can we find these things? But then you get to these boundaries of our known scientific understanding of the universe, and you're like, well, we can only see our observable universe. What's on the outside of this gigantic bubble of our universe, we don't know. We can guess and we can think, but maybe that is the boundary of our simulation. And thinking of multiverse and these bubbles, are those just other those are these other.
It's just the way to madness.
I know. Well, you do have to tether yourself to. But then here's the other one that I find interesting and I know there's this by itself is not, and I think there's been a lot of pushback on it, and that is just the Planck length, right? That if you drill down far enough, we get to you need to describe that because you're going to have some people thinking a plank of wood. Yeah, what is important about the length? The Planck length is the and I'll turn to the physicist in the room to get it to fact check me on this. But essentially, it is the smallest measurable distance. Mm-hmm. So as you go down, and so you drill down into a particle, into an atom, into the subatomic particles.
Yes, yep.
But that's the point at which basically all the laws of physics as we kind of know them break down, right? So you go past that Planck length and there's cannot make sense of anything smaller than this Planck length.
Certainly if you're working within those theories, absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so I think one of the pieces, so again, you kind of come to that bedrock, if you will, and you're like, there's the bit.
And
there's
it's like
the
a
pixel.
bit or a pixel, right?
And there's that.
And if you're inside a video game, you can calculate numbers smaller than a pixel, but you can't physically have anything.
Yes.
And so it's a question of, is space quantized?
Right.
And the Planck length would at least imply that it may be quantized.
Right.
And then the other question is time quantized? And this is actually a bigger, more controversial issue. But there are certain physicists who believe that time is also quantized, that there's a certain smallest amount of time and we can't really measure. And we can calculate the number, but doesn't mean, I can say infinity divided by 2 or times 2 on my, equation, but that doesn't mean we can actually measure that
but presumably that sort of also ties into this idea that we're sort of living in slices of time and you go from one slice to the next.
And that's how microprocessors work, right? So if you go back down to that, I remember when I was
at the clock speed of the universe.
Yeah, it's the clock speed, right? And I remember I totally understand this until we got down at MIT. We were literally building like a microprocessor with wires and stuff. And I realized that each operation. I used to every now and then write in assembly code. I don't know if you guys know assembly languages. So for those who don't know, there's higher level languages like Java, JavaScript,
what people mostly think of
Python.
as a programming language.
Yeah, even C was considered a high-level language when it first came out, even though what C does, though, is it compiles directly down into these opcodes. And then the opcodes, turns out they are actually – they relate to the actual wiring of the microprocessor. Right. And so what happens is that when you say this is 10,000 hertz, it means it's 10,000 cycles per second. And so literally you have a clock that's running like this, that's quantized, and that's one operation. And you can't do anything at less time than that. But more than that, but what's interesting is even in a program or on your laptop, you can have multiple programs running. So your Microsoft Word could be running. You've got your Zoom running over here. You've got the browser. And the program doesn't know how much time has really elapsed. It has to go outside of itself to look for the time. All it knows is this is the last operation I ran. And you could step away from Microsoft Word and you come back, and assuming there's no memory leaks, and it's Mac versus Windows, it may not crash. It may still be running at that exact same point. So you have this ability, this weirdness that time inside the simulation may not be like time outside the simulation.
So one of the things I've actually never been able to wrap my head around, but it intrigues me, and I'm going to butcher this, but it's the idea that the constancy of the speed of light is part of that sort of framing. Sort of that's our sort of internal clock, that you can't sort of break that. So then that defines those slices of time in some way.
Right. And so some people have looked at defined what's called the Planck time, which is the amount of time that it takes the speed of light to go the Planck length.
Same distance.
Right. Yes.
Right. Yep. So it becomes like, a self-referential idea, but basically that as being the smallest operation. And then there are others who, like Stephen Wolfram, who was the physicist who became a computer scientist and researched cellular automata. He created the Mathematica software, and he's got a whole new project.
Great blog, by the way, too.
And he's got a great blog. And he has, if you've read any of his books, there's one, A New Kind of Science, and then another one. They're very big, but they're all about this idea of using computational processes instead of equations as a way to basically derive the laws of the universe. And so he's now come to the point where he believes he can derive things like relativity and other kind of basic laws of physics from a computational perspective. And he defined this phrase, which is used in complexity theory, called computationally irreducible. And basically what that meant was that in order to know what's going to happen, you have to run the process. And if you want to know what happens at step 2 million, you have to go to step
all the way up there.
1,000,999 and then 998 and 997. And there are simple processes where you can predict what's going to happen. There are periodic processes where you know it's going to end up in these two states. But then there's complex and chaotic processes. And those are very difficult to predict.
But this is really important when it comes to simulation theory, because if this is correct, it suggests that even if we're living in a simulation, you've got to play out the simulation. It's not as if you can intervene or somebody can intervene at any point and change the simulation because they know exactly what's going to happen.
Right, but what they can do, just like we do in games and simulation. So people always ask me, why would we be in a simulation? Okay, so this is now we're stepping back. We were down in the weeds with Planck length, and now let's step back.
Pull us out.
And I say, well, I like to ask two different questions for people to understand. Why do we play video games, one? And then two, why do we run simulations? Okay, and this gets at the heart of what I call the NPC versus RPG versions of the simulation hypothesis. And for those that don't know, NPC stands for non-player character or non-playable character, which is a term that came out of Dungeons and Dragons when the dungeon master would basically represent all the characters that were not being played by the players. And in video games, there's like the bartender or the guys you're fighting. Everybody's an NPC. Now we have AI, so we have smart NPCs. But in that version, everyone is just AI running in the computer. And in the RPG version, everyone is a player with a character or an avatar inside the simulation kind of like the Matrix. So if you think of the Matrix, Neo and Morpheus and Trinity they all existed outside, and they had their avatars, which were a term that I like to use, identomorphic. So
identomorphic.
They were not just anthropomorphic, like a human avatars. They looked just like them.
This is what happens to you when you become an academic. You start making words up.
This is what I learned about academia, and so I decided I should make up a word.
Isn't that a missed opportunity though? Like.
But so those two versions of the simulation hypothesis are actually more like different ends of a spectrum.
Right.
Sure.
Right. In the one end, everybody's AI. In another one, everybody's a source player. But the reality is most games are somewhere in the middle. You have characters and you have NPCs within the game. And so back to my two big questions. Why do we play video games? Well, usually it's to have experiences that we can't have outside of the simulation. So we want to be able to do things like fly on dragons and shoot orcs. And I can't do that in this quote-unquote physical reality.
Yeah, that's not fair.
But then why do we run simulations? We run simulations to see what is the most likely outcome, like simulation of the weather, simulation of pandemic
You're basically
spreads.
modeling what we think is reality. Yes.
Right. But nobody runs in that world, nobody runs just one simulation.
Right.
So what do? You go back and you change the variables and you rerun the simulation, but you can save it at any point in time.
Yep.
So even though you have to run the whole thing, you could say, let's save the game at state 1 million. And now we're going to change these two variables and we're going to see which one gets what is the most likely outcome if we run it 1,000 times, but then also what is the most optimal outcome?
Yes.
And now how do we influence the simulation to go down that path?
Yeah. Okay. So my brain just exploded a little bit on the inside. Let me, as I scrape
now
it.
we're in the multiverse world.
Well, and see, again, this is again coming back to this idea of like, can we tell? Can't we tell? And there's really no way to tell. So that instantly all just made me think when we think about, again, the multiplicity of timelines, right? That every choice or every decision, if you think about it in that sense, sort of forks where these, the path that you do take plus all of the potential paths that you could have taken.
Right.
And in the simulation hypothesis, like those could all be represented as different simulation. Like each one of those points is a branch of a simulation.
Yep. Yeah. And my second book, The Simulated Multiverse, is about this idea.
Available everywhere.
I thought I had gone down the rabbit hole enough. I finished this book, it did well, but I just couldn't get this idea out of my head that, if you could run one simulation, why can't you run multiple simulations? And I had interviewed the wife of Philip K. Dick, the science fiction writer, as part
famously has also suggested that everything was a simulation, right?
Yeah. So back in 1977, in a speech in Metz, France, he said, "We are living in a computer-programmed reality, and the only clue we have to it is when some variable is
something
changed.
Changes.
Some alteration occurs in our reality." Now, that's become a pretty famous line. He was part of the inspiration for the Wachowskis.
Yeah, sure.
Created the Matrix.
Yes.
So first of all, I asked his wife, Tessa, I said, well, what would he think of the Matrix? And she said, well, first of all, he'd love it. Yeah, and that would be his first thought. And his second thought would be to call his agent to see if he could sue these guys
for ripping
off his ideas. And I thought that is really funny.
Yep. That is funny.
But, she encouraged me to go back and look at the full speech. Because that was just a little line.
Snippet from it, yeah.
And so I went back afterwards, and I had seen it earlier, but I really went through and started analyzing it. There's a written version of the speech, and the speech was called "If You Think This World Is Bad, You Should See Some of the Others." And of course, at the time, people thought he was just crazy, right? I mean, you can see the video, like all these people in the audience in France, including like his friend Joan Simpson, I think was her name. She was there with him, just looking like, "What is this guy?"
Starting to slowly sliding away.
And turns out he had ad-libbed that line.
Oh, nice!
It's not in the written version of the speech.
Oh, interesting.
About living in a computer program reality.
Yep,
so you could see on the plane, he was probably like, handwriting that line in because he was reading from a script.
Yep.
But when I read the whole speech, I realized what he was really talking about was this idea that you can basically change a variable and rerun the simulation and you'll get a different timeline. Now, this is where it gets a little weird. So Tessa told me that he came to believe that The Man in the High Castle, which was about a timeline where Germany and Japan won World War II. And for those that don't know, it was his only like Hugo Award-winning book, and it became a series on Amazon. But he came to believe that was a real timeline that actually happened,
existed,
and that the simulators changed some variables and reran another timeline.
But why did
which is the timeline we're in now.
Right, but why did he think that was a possibility? What were the indications, or is this just his speculation?
Well, it was partly his speculation, but in his case, people say, okay, he's a science fiction writer. So, but he came to believe that at some point he wrote this book off of what he called partially fragmented memories of another timeline, of another alternate present.
Right. I mean, so there's some sort of bleed over.
Yeah, and then he said when she told me this, I didn't know about this, but she said he started to write the sequel, which he never finished, by the way. But that he said he got full memories of his alternate timeline, of what he called an alternate present, right? So it was the same date, but it was with a different timeline. And then it gets weirder. People say, well, he took a lot of drugs, so, no. But she said, well, he claimed to have been in contact with beings that were telling him that, hey, we've altered timelines before. And this is just one branch, but then I said, well, what if we took this as an interesting idea and take a riff on it? And he said, what we would need to do is find other people who have memories of
the same timeline.
Yes. And turns out there's a whole group of people, something called the Mandela effect. So now we're way off.
I was just going to say, this explains the Mandela effect. It explains deja vu. It explains,
But I also must say, it doesn't explain how you have that crossbleed. Because if you're running multiple programs, multiple models, how on earth do you get that sort of cross-integration between them?
Well, it's an interesting question, and I think it gets back to the RPG versus
or
NPC
memory leak
model.
Right?
Because is it possible that you remember what happened in the other timeline because you were an actual participant in that timeline if you were the player?
Right.
Or the memory leak. So there's a process in computer science called garbage collection. And what happens is you put stuff in memory and you leave it there. And if somebody accesses that memory, they're going to get the value from before.
This is what I hate about you. You come up with an excuse for everything.
But if you go back to quantum physics, this is what I found interesting about the simulation hypothesis. Now, you can believe it literally, or you can say this is a metaphor.
Sure.
And so and I believe it's somewhere in the middle between those, because it's kind of like saying, if you look at our video games versus the games in the 80s, like they're much more advanced, right? I mean, back then you would say there's no way you could create a world like World of Warcraft or Fortnite because there's too many pixels.
Right.
Right.
You couldn't do it. Technologically
It's what I call
impossible.
the brute force method. And this is what I think physicists love, kind of infinity. Well, if you have infinite power, you could do stuff, right? Or there's too many particles, there's no way a computer could keep track of them. But in computer science, it's all about optimization. So you're trying to basically come up, and we've come up with optimization techniques, 3D models and other things, which have allowed us to create entire, virtual worlds which are huge. So like No Man's Sky, which I've never played myself, but people would say
it's
an
nice.
interesting. But you know how many worlds they have? How many planets they have?
There's a number, but it's staggering.
It's 18 quintillion.
Yeah. Okay.
Right? And so there's no way.
I was going to get that wrong.
No way you can render all of that. Yes.
No game design team. I've been part of game design teams could do that. So they had to use procedural generation to do all of that. But it's only generated when it's necessary. Right. And then they can store that information. And so when you go back to quantum physics and you look at the weirdness of the observer problem or the measurement problem more technically, the two most popular interpretations, and we have a physicist in the room, so you can tell, are the Copenhagen interpretation and the multiverse interpretation. The problem is they both have detractors to say, okay, this can't be. And the Copenhagen...
It's evidence both ways.
But that's the beauty of physics. I mean, you make stuff up, and if somebody can't disprove you...
Right. But I would say that the simulation hypothesis solves... one of the biggest problems with each of those.
Which is really interesting. I do want to go back a second because we mentioned the Mandela effect, but we should probably just say really briefly what that is.
Oh my goodness. And also for anyone listening we can put a link, but you can Google this and go down your own rabbit hole and enjoy it. But essentially the Mandela effect is just a concept of basically like a shared misremembrances of things. And for me, one of the biggest one is the Berenstain Bears. And it's
one of the most famous
tells
ones.
You which universe you're in.
Yeah, that's right. and it's as simple as asking you to remember without looking it up, right? To remember these things and ask a simple question. How was it spelled? Was it Berenstain or was it Berenstein Bears? And I would swear up and down that it is Berenstein. Berenstain Bears, not the Berenstain Bears. Right. And then you go look and you're like, that you have this moment where all of what you know to be true in your own sense of memory and everything is suddenly faced with your present reality that it is not the case.
Yep.
And same with the what's the one it's the Peanut Man, right? Or whether he's wearing a monocle. Whether he has a monocle.
Mr. Peanut?
Yeah, Mr. Peanut is
the Monopoly guy.
The Monopoly guy.
Yeah,
and
it's one of those.
And of course with Nelson Mandela. That false memory that he died in prison.
Died in prison.
Yep. Right. And so many people remember these events. And so I classified these events into different categories to say, okay, well, and I thought they were just kind of false memories too.
Yeah.
I mean, that was the standard explanation.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I had a friend of mine from MIT who was working for Google. We were having lunch, and I had just released my book, and he says, "Have you looked at the Mandela effect?" I'm like, yeah, I've heard of it. But, people are having bad memories. He goes, "Well, simulation theory would explain that."
Yeah.
I started to scratch my head, and that's what got me to go down this other rabbit hole. But there were like simple letter changes, like Bernstein versus Bernstein, or Fruit Loops, logos.
Yep.
But when you got to certain events, like Mandela dying in prison, or do you remember Tiananmen Square? What happened with the guy in front of the tank?
Oh, yeah. Does he get run over or not?
Yeah. And there are people who swear that was the bloodiest thing they saw on television at 89, where he was run over. I don't remember him being run over.
Now, I thought he was. Now you're messing with my mind.
No, because if you look it up, assuming we're still in the same reality that we were last time I looked it up, that he did not get run over, which is what I remember. But there are people who swear they saw him. So I said, well, you have to look at this in terms of significance.
Yes.
Yeah. And proximity. And I said, okay, if somebody is, to whom that's not significant, misremembers it, it's no big deal.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if it's somebody who had proximity to the event or knew something about the event, then it's more likely that maybe they are remembering something interesting. So, for example, I came across a YouTuber that was in journalism school in the 80s. And she was supposed to go to South Africa to visit Nelson Mandela. And I think she actually went there, but they said he was too ill in prison and she wasn't able to interview him.
Right.
Then she came back to work for NPR in Chicago, and she heard that he died. Now, somebody who went to South Africa to interview Nelson Mandela is not going to get that wrong.
Right. You would have thought.
Some random guy. Well, yeah. So the question is, are these shared memories perhaps indicative of something more than just false memories? And so I use it as more of an example. Now, my favorite ones are the physical objects. And so, the thinker. You know the thinker?
Oh,
Yes,
yeah.
So where is his hand?
Yeah.
And so if you look
For
at
me,
it.
it's under the chin.
Yeah,
just like
And
that.
is it a clenched fist or
For me, it's
light?
a clenched fist.
Clenched fist?
Yeah. I think to me, actually, no.
It's more like a light.
That's right.
Like
yeah.
a
And
shelf.
so there's three versions that people remember. One is a clenched fist. One is a light kind of curl of the fingers. But then the more interesting one to me is when the hand is
Like
on the forehead. And there are all these pictures of people saying they're on the forehead.
Right.
And including, there's a famous picture of what's his name? G.B. Shaw. And the picture was taken just before the unveiling of the first bronze cast of the Thinker in London in like 1905 or something like that. I don't remember the exact year. And it says, G.B. Shaw in the pose of the Thinker, and he's standing there like this with his hand on his forehead. And so you start to wonder, is it possible that in fact we're remembering, or if you were to rerun the simulation and just change small things, you might end up with little changes down the road. I mean, the whole idea of chaos theory is little changes could result in big changes down the road.
That's right, yeah. But it also has this feel of the butterfly effect, that idea if we could sort of either change things remotely or go back in time and change things.
Right.
But now this whole idea of multiple simulations and going back in time gets really weird.
It does. And so the question becomes one of, it's pretty easy for us to envision multiple possible futures, right?
Right, yes.
I might, move to Boston, I might move to Los Angeles, etc. But it's pretty hard for us to imagine multiple possible pasts.
Right.
But when you start having a grid, which I call the multiverse graph of all the choices, and you have this sort of infinite tree, but you could trim the infinite tree. In computer science, we would trim the tree. Physicists would say it just goes on forever.
Yes.
And the Marvel universe has captivated us with Loki and the TVA and all that kind of stuff, right? That there's
exactly.
There's this entity entity that exists above all that is
this
in
is the
charge
episode
of.
for geeks.
I know. Yeah.
But
You don't entitle a podcast Modem Futura and
not geek out.
but is it possible there are multiple possible pasts?
Right.
Yeah, why
And
not?
there are some interpretations of quantum mechanics
Yes.
that say that not only are we choosing our present, but we are choosing from the past. And and so even though physicists will say you can't change the past, retrocausation,
Yeah.
at least theoretically, but you can potentially choose a past. And,
Right.
And so I looked around and I found an obscure speech by Schrodinger from the
interesting.
1940s.
Okay, this is from Schrodinger's cat, right?
From Schrodinger's cat.
Yes,
And we can
yeah.
talk about Schrodinger's
Sure.
cat if we want in a minute. But he actually said that what we're doing is when we choose, a particular quantum choice, let's say the collapse, the probability way, we are choosing not only which present we're in, like is the cat alive or dead?
Yep.
We're also choosing from one of, and he actually used this phrase, multiple simultaneous histories.
Right.
Okay. Which implies that there are these multiple simultaneous histories
Yeah.
and we're choosing one of them. And probably the best way to illustrate this is the cosmic delayed choice experiment.
Oh, yeah.
Do you know about this?
Yes.
It was proposed by John Wheeler.
So here's another one of those things where you're like, there's no way we could be living. And then you come across these examples. You're like, wait a minute, maybe we are.
And so Wheeler, there's the double slit experiment,
Yep.
which is sort of the basis for this idea of Schrodinger's cat.
Yep.
And Schrodinger defined the cat experiment because he thought the whole idea was ridiculous.
Right.
He goes, how could a cat be both alive and dead?
at the same time.
And yet quantum physicists are telling us
Yep.
that that's the case. That
Yes,
they're
you've got
in,
indeterminate state. Yes.
yeah, they're in superposition.
Yeah.
But so Wheeler came up with this idea of a delayed double choice experiment. And rather than getting into slits and all that, he came up with a cosmic version to make it really easy to visualize. And he said, suppose there was a quasar 1 billion light years away from us. So how long would the light take to reach us? 1 billion
years.
Billion years. And when it left, it would have left 1 billion years ago.
Yep.
And he said, suppose somewhere in the middle, there's a black hole that, or a gravity.
Some kind of lensing,
lensing thing,
element.
which makes the light
bends
go
it.
to the right or left. And we have two telescopes here that can pick up whether it went right or left.
yes.
We can measure
Yes.
the polarity of the light, let's say. And so the right or left kind of is a way to approximate the double slits in this case. And suppose that object is 1 million light years away from us.
Right.
So when would the decision of whether it goes right or left
happen.
have been made?
Right.
1 million years ago.
ago.
Right? So maybe after the end of the dinosaurs, but before humans. And yet, what the cosmic delayed choice experiment and delayed choice double slit experiments are telling us is that it's only when the measurement happens that the
That's
choice is
determined,
made.
yes.
Yeah.
So
1
we're
million years
literally
in its future.
choosing
Yeah.
what happened back in the time of the dinosaurs.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because that's when the waveform collapses.
Yeah.
That started. Yes.
And that-
Yep.
Yeah.
And we should just pause for a moment to let people's brains, but let the roiling bubbles simmer for a second. Because that is, I think, one of the most fun things for me to just like mentally just keep turning over and over, right? This idea that our physical observation is the moment at which it's been determined 1 million years prior to whether it went left. Was it A or B, left or right or whatever? Which is just absolutely fascinating.
And now they've done experimental versions of the delayed choice double slit experiment, but obviously not 1 million light years
Right,
away, but
yep.
they've sent things to a satellite that's like maybe 1,000 miles away. So there is a little bit of time.
Yes.
And they've generally confirmed that it's when the measurement happens that the wave collapses.
Right. But that's the whole idea of this. I don't know which term you would use, either quantum coherence or whatever.
Yeah.
But the fact that point of observation actually has some sort of connection with what happened at a previous point.
At a previous point in time,
Yes.
because that will tell you whether it went through slit A or B
right.
before the measurement.
To some extent, this is wild too. Just okay, so we're all sitting we're around the same table here, and it's weird to even think about that just at the most if we call this the most micro level. Like I'm not seeing Riz or Andrew as like I'm seeing you as you were, like however long it takes the light to leave your body and reach my
But
nerves.
I love the fact that you still think we're real.
Wait, maybe, yeah. This is there should have been a trigger warning before this episode of like ground yourself to something real that you hold. That what's your totem, right? To like
Right, to tell you if you're in a dream or not, right?
Although I've got to tell you, so Riz was in a class with my undergrads a couple of weeks ago where we were talking about simulation theory.
Oh, fantastic.
And most of them were both fascinated with the idea, but most of them said, what does it matter? If we're living in a simulation, we can't tell the difference between reality and simulation.
What doesn't matter?
So what?
So what?
Yeah.
And it's another big question is Does it matter for me or not?
Right.
And then there are those who believe we should not try to find out if we're in a simulation. And there was a philosophy professor, I think his name is Preston Green, who wrote an op-ed for the New York Times a few years ago. And he said, let's stop trying to find out if we're in a simulation. And his basic argument was that if we did find definitive proof, that the simulators would shut us down if we're in a simulation. And if we're not in a simulation, then it wouldn't matter anyway.
So I've got to bring this up. So Douglas Adams, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, I brought up exactly this in a quip when he was sort of talking about sort of this author sort of writing about the existence of God and sort of reaching that point of definitive proof, at which point God just disappeared and everything disappeared and the universe rebooted.
Right, rebooted. There you go.
Yes.
Yeah. That said, I think it depends a lot on this RPG versus NPC axis. And that's why most academics who talk about this usually talk about the NPC version, right? So if the system reboots. Now, what happens in the RPG version? System reboots, well, you just come out of your virtual reality headset and you decide if you want to go back in and play the next version as well. So I think the answer of whether it matters or not depends on where you fall on that axis.
Yes.
And so I mentioned Nick Bostrom earlier. I'll mention another philosopher who's well known named David Chalmers, who in 2003, the same year as Bostrom defined the simulation argument, which then came to be known as the simulation hypothesis. He defined the matrix hypothesis. And so his article, which was in a book on philosophy of the Matrix, when they released, I think, the second Matrix movie, or the third Matrix movie, the Wachowskis actually got real philosophers to write essays about this idea that we might be in a virtual reality. And you know, he was talking more about being in a VR headset and a virtual reality. But he's sort of given up on that terminology, the Matrix hypothesis, because everybody is using the simulation hypothesis as it. But you know, he basically came to the conclusion that he goes, if the simulation was perfect, we wouldn't necessarily be able to tell. Right. It just depends on if there's glitches in the matrix or not. I personally believe there are glitches in the matrix, right? And I believe the Mandela effect is one of them, but there are all kinds of weird things that people report that we in academia don't take seriously, whether it's ghosts, it's, you know, weird things, coincidences happening.
All the paranormal stuff could just be those boundaries. I mean, even just like the multiverse element too of like supernatural is like, are those weak points between the two where they're, you know what I mean? Like,
you're remembering this weird thing that didn't happen.
Passing through, you know, that's wild.
And that's where we now start to touch on the religious side as well. Right?
Sure.
Yeah. In fact, you know, simulation theory has been called religion for atheists, right? But Bostrom made the point that many atheists, when they start considering we might be in a simulation, will at least readily admit, well, okay, anything outside the simulation might, one, as you said earlier, Andrew, not be bound by the physics or the rules of this. So would appear supernatural, right? They would appear to have superpowers from our perspective. And so whether you call those gods, angels, demons, jinn in the Islamic traditions, but people, entities that are not necessarily bound by the same rules that we're in. And then you get into the whole idea of Maya, which in the Hindu traditions, going back 5,000 plus years, is illusion. The translation for Maya is that the world is, I mean, that's like a core tenet of almost all of the faiths of the world. Like there's using science fiction, there's a scene in Battlestar Galactica where the Cylons, who are AI, but are weirdly religious compared to the humans. One of them, you know, says to one of the characters, says, "What's the basic article of faith?" And she's like, "I don't know." And she goes, "Well, it's that this is not all there is." And that is actually turns out to be one of the common elements of across all the religions is that the physical world is not all there is. But they use metaphors to try to describe it. So they use the dream as a common metaphor in Buddhism, for example, that the world is a dream. Maya is that it's an illusion. There's the term Leela, which is it's a play of the gods. Shakespeare talks about a stage play. And so I think if these religions were to be founded today, and even in the Quran, there's actually passages which say, we have set this up for you as a pastime and a sport, as a game and a diversion, right? For you to play, right? They keep using this. And in fact, there's a term in Arabic that's used in one of these verses that I saw it used multiple times. And I said, oh, that's interesting because it reminds me so much of the Hindu scriptures. And it was al-garuri matau. And that means a delusion, but an enjoyable delusion. Enjoyable
and we're
quotes.
straight back to gaming.
And we're straight back to gaming. But then you look at the Hindu definitions of Maya, it's not just an illusion. It's like a carefully crafted illusion that you give yourself permission to be fooled by.
Right.
It's kind of like going to a magic show.
Yes.
You know the guy's not
Suspending
really sawing the woman in half, but it's no fun.
Right.
If you're critical about it, same with going to the movies. If you're just sitting there criticizing everything, it's no fun.
It's no fun. And so Swami Yogananda, who wrote a book called Autobiography of Yogi, and he was one of the first Indian yogis to come to the U.S. about 100 years ago and live in the U.S. And this book became like, Steve Jobs' favorite book. And it was the only book on his iPad, and all the counterculture, people were giving it away it was one of those paperbacks in the Haight-Ashbury in 1968. I literally met a guy who said, "Yep, that's how I got it. Somebody just gave me a copy in Haight-Ashbury."
Yep, sure.
And then when I read it, I
never know what you're going to find in Haight-Ashbury.
Passed it on to the next guy. But he came over in the 1920s and he said, "Well, let's use a different metaphor." And it's exactly the metaphor you're talking about.
Yep.
He said, "Let's use that of a movie projector." He said, "When the characters in the movie die, the actors don't die,
Yes.
right? But it's that light and shadow that's playing to make it look real."
Right. Yes.
And so, he would tell his disciples and people he's teaching, look away from the screen and see the light, and then you can start to see the illusion.
Yes.
But there has to be suffering in the actual movie because that's what makes it interesting.
And now
that's
you're
what
getting
makes it
into
an enjoyable delusion.
Right. Now you're getting into the whole complex area of sort of the human experience.
Right, and ethics and suffering.
That's probably not a rabbit hole we want to go down this episode.
Well, and it's interesting. I mean, just even hearing you describe that reminds me going way back, right, to Plato and stuff with the cave allegory, right?
Yes.
Of which, if people are not familiar, it's a simple thought experiment you can come up with if you had, certain people chained to, it's so barbaric to chained to a wall inside of a cave, but you can't leave the cave, right? You have a fixed position, and the only way you can observe the world is from the shadows happening behind you, being cast on the cave wall. So your entire understanding of what's happening is based on these shadows.
That is your reality.
That's your interpretation of life. And even if you might know or suspect there's things out there, you can't access it because you're chained to this cave.
Right.
You can't leave the cave.
It's shadows on the wall. And then what happens in his allegory of the cave? What happens is one guy breaks his chains.
Yes.
Yep.
He's a philosopher. Goes outside. The first thing that happens is he can't see because there's too much light.
Right.
But then once he gets accustomed
he's
to it,
enlightened.
He's enlightened.
Yes.
He realizes there's this thing called the sun that's the source of all the light. And he comes back in and tries to explain to people, and they say, "You're crazy."
You're crazy.
Right. Yes. Right.
Yep.
In a weird,
Riz, do you have some sort of resonance here?
Yes. In a weird kind of reference to that, there was a guy recently who took this smart NPC engine. So it's these are engines that use LLMs. And they hooked them up to avatars inside a virtual world. And he took this demo built by Warner Brothers and Epic called The Matrix Awakens. And it was from 2021 when the new Matrix movie came out. And it was a very realistic city with all these NPCs running around. And he made them smart NPCs. And so he walked around and started telling these NPCs, "You're just NPCs in a video game." And they reacted just like people in the physical world.
So you must be kidding. No,
you're crazy.
Yeah, someone say, "I'm too busy. I got to get to work."
Yeah, we're gonna lock you up.
And every now and then, maybe somebody that would say,
funny.
"Hey, tell me more."
Probably the best proof ever that we're living in a simulation.
Yeah, well, and it's just wild too because it raises all these questions too, right? So and again, I think there's a lot that hinges on that discoverability. Like, are we or are we not, and do we want to know? Because what does that do? Again, thinking about the ethical components, like when does a virtualized NPC, for example, right? When do they get rights, or what is their I think that a lot of those kind of things would dramatically change if that answer would be defined.
But it gets doubly weird if you do accept the hypothesis that we're living in a simulation and you're asking things about AI rights, robot rights. It then becomes really weird in terms of how you differentiate between us, who are simulated, and an AI that is simulated.
Right. And you have the trolley problem in AI. Now you have the sim trolley problem.
Goodness me.
Yeah.
Which is, would you kill 1 million simulated characters to save one biological person?
Goodness.
It's funny. We just talked about in our self-driving car episode. Of course, we had to talk about the trolley. We can't escape the trolley problem. It seems like.
Yes. Yep. Much as I detest it, but yes.
It keeps coming up, right?
I know.
So awesome. Well, I think All right, we've had you here, Riz. Thank you for spending so much time with us. We'll try to land our plane here or end the simulation. I don't know. I'm trying to work up a clever way to get his stories in. I would be curious. So I think I saw on social media too that your book, The Simulation Hypothesis, is getting a second printing. Is this true?
Well, it's getting a second edition. So in fact, you can only buy the first edition for like another week or so, and then they're going to stop selling the first edition. And next year in July, the second edition, which has a lot of updates because I wrote the book in 2019. I published it on the 20th anniversary of The Matrix, which was March 31st, 1999.
Oh, that's cool. I didn't realize I didn't realize that the timing was intentional. Or
yeah, it was intentional.
Okay.
Yeah. And then this year is the 25th anniversary of the release of The Matrix. And I was hoping to get the second edition out this year, but publishers like Penguin Random House, they take like a year.
Which shouldn't happen in a simulation. Somebody should be able to fix it.
Right, you would think, right? But it'll be available for pre-order really starting next week.
Right.
Oh, very cool. Yeah. Very cool. Awesome. Any last things you want to plug or share in any of your current work or anything new? What's going on? Anything you want to share?
So right now, primarily I'm finishing up the second edition and the editing on that. There's also the simulated multiverse, which is goes down the rabbit hole we went down today of multiple timelines and the Mandela effect. And I'm also working on bringing together different religious ideas with simulation theory and showing how, in fact, all the scriptures, assuming it's something like the Plato's cave. I like to say that most religions are founded by someone who breaks the chains and goes outside and becomes
enlightened.
But then when they come back, they have to explain it in terms that the folks inside would understand. And so they have to use terminology and examples and metaphors. And so they used these techno-scientific metaphors like the wheel of samsara. I mean, a wheel is a technological metaphor. But today, and I mentioned Yogananda used the movie metaphor. Today, I believe if these guys were alive today, they would say it's like a movie, but it's an interactive movie where the players, where the actors, where the audience, we have a script, but we can change the script. What does it sound like? It sounds like a massively multiplayer online role-playing game. And we have a soul, which is like a player, and a body, which is like the avatar. So I'm kind of going down that rabbit hole, but that book probably won't be published for
something to look forward to.
A little while. Yeah.
Well, I think clearly we've demonstrated we love a good rabbit hole. And go. So yeah, Andrew, any final sort of thoughts on this one?
Oh goodness me, my brain is bubbling.
I know.
So now I understand why Lex Friedman has these massive long podcasts, because we could have gone on forever. But this has been fantastic. We're going to have you back.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. So again, and thank you for everyone who's listening. Riz, thank you again for joining us. Andrew, pleasure as always. And so
thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll make sure to drop in show notes again where you can follow and catch up with all of his other books, as well as any future books that are going to be coming out. So again, thank you. And that's it for this episode of Modem Futura. We'll see you on the next one.
Demodulating signal.
Modem Futura is a production of the Future of Being Human initiative at Arizona State University. Be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. To learn more about the Future of Being Human initiative and all of our other projects, please visit us on the web at futureofbeinghuman.asu.edu.
End transmission.